Hi and welcome to another video. This is part 2 of a series of videos where we look at the Node-RED dashboard template node or widget. In an earlier video we looked at displaying data on a dashboard using the widget, and in this video we're going to carry on looking at that, and we're also going to look at inputting data into a flow using the template node. If you remember from the last video, and I will put a link in the description below to the previous video, and you should watch that video before you watch this one. Anyway, we finished there. We were injecting an array of objects into our template node and displaying them with the template node. And this is what the template node looked like. And you can see here we're picking out the individual elements of the array using this syntax here. And you can see there's the first element and there's the second element. Now this works very well if you know how many elements you have in the array, but if you don't know how many elements you have in the array, then you can't use this format here. So we're going to look at how you do that if you've got an undetermined number of elements in the array. So let's go and look at that flow. So we have to switch, and we're on to this here. We're still injecting the same data, that hasn't changed here, and this is our template node here. Now you should notice here I've added a class called main, and I've created a style to style this div tag here, and it's just a very basic style, and it's just to illustrate the fact that we can actually use styles in our template node. Now this is the actual thing I really wanted to show you here. We've got the same header as we had before, but this time we're using this here, ng repeat, and it's ng repeat y message.payload. So y, it's like a for loop, and y is going to take on the value of message.payload. So now I just use y.sensor, y.battery, and y.temp. This replaces the message.payload bracket 0 or bracket 1 that we needed earlier. And you'll also notice that I've got the TD tags here. So this is basically the ng repeat is going to run through the array, and we've got two elements in the array, and it's going to create the TD tags, and it's going to create the data inside those tags there. And you can see where the repeat is going, it's going in the table row. So for each one it's going to create a row. So we're going to have two rows, and in those rows we're going to have these elements. And we can see that here when we look at the dashboard, and here it is. Here you can see the elements are displayed in the table just like they were before. Okay, now we're going to look at entering data into the template node, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to disable these and then enable the next test. So if you download this flow, then you'll have to remember to do this, otherwise they'll all appear on the same dashboard and it looks a bit messy, so it's easy to see them if I just disable them. So you can see I've disabled the ones down here, and as we move down I'll enable them and disable this one here. So let's have a look at the template node, and what we've got here is we're using the ng model, and the ng model is basically going to take an input, and it's going to assign it here to this variable called name. So we got an input field here, it's a text field. The ng model assigns that input into the variable name, and we're using the ng bind one up here just to display that name into the form. So all the data here is going to stay on the page. It's not going to be sent out of the node at all. We're just going to use it internally. Okay, so this is what it looks like. So if we just type in our name here, and you can see the name just gets repeated above here, as I explained when we looked at the code. Okay, let's move on to example 7, and this time we're actually going to send data out of the form, or out of the dashboard node, and this is the code for the template node, and I've enabled this now. So we've still got our input type text, we've still got the ng model, and using the name, And this time we're going to use the ng change, so anytime it changes, we're going to use the send to send out the payload. Now notice here I've created my own object here with payload here and name here. So also notice that this is in quotes, and this becomes important later when we actually have values here that also need to be quoted. We're going to need to use the single quotes for the one and the double quotes for the other, and I'll show you that later on. But here's, see how I've constructed it here. Again, we're displaying the name on the page, but we don't have to. So let's have a look what this looks like. Just want to turn on the debug so we can actually see it. And there it is there, and you see I type it in, the name there, it appears there, and if you look at the debug node you can see every time I typed in a letter it got sent out of this node here, the template node, and I was picking it up in the debug node. Okay, so that's one way of getting data out of the dashboard node, and we're going to move on now to example 8. Let's just disable that one and enable this one. In this example we're going to put the two together, we're going to display data and we're going to send data out of the node. So I've got a function node here which is injecting the same data we had previously, so a sense of data with battery and temperature. And let's show you what it looks like here, and just inject to inject it. And you can see here it's the same data, and this time we've got a little tick box here, a little button which we press to say OK. So if we look at the code for this, you can see here this is what we had previously to display our data. Now this is going to display our button, so I've got an input type and it's a type of button, and when I click the button I'm going to send, and this time for the payload I'm actually sending the index. What I'm sending, because remember this is an array, so I'm going to send the index of the array, which is either going to be 0 or 1 because I've got two elements in the array. And I'm also going to send a topic, and notice I've called it OK, and I've got this in single quotes because the entire thing is in double quotes. I could use either one, I could put that in single quotes and this in double quotes, but I've chosen to do it this way here. Now I use this arrangement in quite a few of my flows. One for sending out emails, so I've got a list of emails that are going to go out. I can click on the OK button to send the email, and I've got another button I can click on to delete the email from the email queue. So it's quite a common thing to do. So the dollar index picks up the value of the index in the for loop, and there's our for loop using ng repeat. Let's just deploy it, clear that, and we've got it in there. So if I click on this one here, OK, the first element, you can see here the payload is 0, the topic is OK, and if I click on the second one, you see the payload is 1, the topic is still OK. Now before we leave this example, you may have noticed this delay node in here, and it's coming from the template and it's going back into the function node. It's going to re-inject the data, because remember we inject it manually through here. Now what that does is basically refresh the template node, and you can see why if I actually remove it and deploy it, and this time when I press OK it all disappears. So the purpose of that loop there is to refresh the display. Now while we're on that subject, what I often do in my flows is I actually have an inject node here, and I have it inject every second or every few seconds to refresh the display, so it refreshes the display automatically. So when I'm displaying data in the dashboard node, one of the most common things I do is I collect it in another part of the flow, and I usually store it in a flow variable or a global variable, and then I use the template node along with the eject node and a function node to display that data, but it's actually outside of the the data collection, so that it's running parallel to the data collection rather than collecting the data and coming right out the data collection is injecting into the display. I tend to do the two things separately. Okay, so let's move on to the last example in this video, and again I'll just disable that one and enable the other one. So this is what the dashboard looks like. I'm just going to enter a value in here, and I'm going to pick up that value and I'm going to store that value in a variable, and I can use that variable in the flow. And I've got two ways of actually entering the data here, and you only need one way, but I'm going to show you both methods in the one example. So I'm going to enter the value here, and I'm just going to click. So I click with the button, or enter to enter the value, or I just press OK to enter the value. Now I prefer the OK button rather than clicking here, because it's not a normal thing to do. So I prefer to enter it in there and click OK to enter the data. It gives you far more control of the data input, but it's a matter of choice. So let's go and look at the flow and the code. The first thing is we're going to store the data in a flow variable, and you can see here I've called it data, and I'm going to initialize that data, and I'm going to initialize it to 0. You can see here, and now I'm going to set the data using the flow set, and that's done by this initialization node here. So here are values here that they're set to 0 when I initialized it here, and if I look at the dashboard, you can see it hasn't changed, and it hasn't changed because it's not part of the flow. That changes when I inject here in this timestamp here, and what that does here is this function node just basically picks up that data from the flow variable and it returns it in the payload. So if I inject, we're set to 0. So coming out of this node here, this template node here, then we have a function that basically just stores the data, so it stores it back into the flow variable. So if we look at the template node itself, now I'm using the for loop here, or the ng repeat loop should I say, and I'm picking up the message not payload in Y. Now I'm using the ng model for the input. It's also actually the output, because we're going to output the value as well as input the value, and I'm going to store it in the variable called value, and then when I click on this I'm going to send the message. Now as I said, there's two ways of it. I can actually click and send the message, or alternatively I can click on the button, which is the code here, to send the message. Now I prefer to use this one, so normally I'd remove that and I wouldn't have that there, but I wanted to show you both methods that you can use. Okay, so let's enter some data in here and let's see what happens. So if I enter 4 in here and 6 in here, and I'm going to click them both to make sure they get sent. If I look at the you can see there's and there. Now remember, we're storing them in an array. The array is called data, and if I go back and look at the array in our flow data, you can see they're being stored here, 4 and 6, and they're being stored by this function node here. Okay, so now we know how to display data. We also know how to input data into a template node. In the next video we're going to look at adding icons to your flow, adding slider buttons to a flow. Common things that I've added to my flows. I'm going to show you how to do those things, and also how to style things like traffic lights and things, so we can get displays with red, orange and green lights on there. And I'm going to show you how to do that, not directly by styling it in the style sheet here, but by passing the actual colors and whatever through it with the data what you're injecting into the template node. So that's coming up in the next video. Now if you look at the information on this node, it also goes into scripting, where we can implement what they call a controller. I'm not going to cover that in this video series, not this particular video series. The reason is I haven't used that myself in any of my flows. I'm still trying to learn that bit of it, so as soon as I do, then I will do a video about it. But I say we're not going to be covering this in this current series. So that brings us to the end of the video. If you've got comments on the video, then please leave them below. If you like the video, then click on the like button below, and you can always subscribe to the channel and click on the notification bell to get notified of new videos that I post on the channel. And if you do use social media and like to share it, then please feel free. I do actually have a newsletter on the website that I publish occasionally, so if you want to subscribe to that, you can head over to the website and subscribe to that. Okay, until next time, goodbye.